I was in college in 1967, and you had to take and pass a full load 15 hours every quarter. And I was taking 17 hours working, playing a little ball, and I had a physics class that was killing me. So I dropped the physics class and got down to 13 hours spring quarter. And the next thing I know, I lose my deferment, and a couple weeks later, I get a letter from the draft board. So I went down and signed up for ROTC. And 3.5 years later, I've graduated, and I'm in the Army, and I get orders to go to Vietnam. I was scared. I was very scared. The very first thing I saw when I got there was Cam Ranh Bay, which is where we landed. You can see the ships, and you can see a lot of artillery and bombs out here being unloaded. I was assigned to a construction engineer battalion in the Army Corps of Engineers. And we built roads, airfields, and bridges. We were one of the premier road building units in all of Vietnam. We were really good, had a lot of equipment. We were in a village out in the boonies, building our roads. We were 30, 40 miles away from our battalion headquarters. And we were in a small village. And the villagers there really liked us because we were supporting their economy. And they didn't have much. And we hired a bunch of them to work in our compound. And we had a lot of the men who would work on our construction projects with us. So they were very grateful that we were there because we were supporting their little village. We were on the side of a big mountain, and that mountain was triple canopy jungle, and when we were building a road through it, and it was pretty dense stuff. A lot of animals. We saw tigers. We saw a lot of snakes and all kinds of interesting things. The high point of my tour, my original tour in Vietnam, was definitely the construction projects we did. We built one of the major highways in all of Vietnam, QL 27, from Phan Rang to Da Lat. It's a major highway, and it's still there. From there, we moved on to Phu Bai, and we moved our entire unit up to Phu Bai and Hue, and rebuilt airfields for the 101st Airborne in that area. The last 2 months of my tour, we were sent to Da Nang, and we were building a road from Da Nang into Hoi An. The Viet Cong had blown a bridge. We were replacing that bridge, and we were also building a sand cement road through that entire area. Those were big projects, and that was really the high point of my tour, and it gave me a lot of experience for what ultimately I ended up doing with my civilian career later. Definitely the low point was when we would lose someone due to conflict and the enemy. We lost a few guys over there. We had a few guys injured in construction-related accidents because we were dealing with a lot of big equipment, and we had some fairly inexperienced people doing it. So I love to travel, and I always wanted to go back to Vietnam, and I always wondered how what we built over there had held up. And my wife loves to travel, but she didn't want to go to Vietnam. And so I convinced one of the guys that was there with me, who was also a lieutenant, and he was a lawyer in San Francisco, and single, so I convinced him to go with me. And so we took off, and we planned this for 2 years, and we spent 3 weeks over there on our tour. It's a beautiful country. The people there are very gracious. There's no animosity toward the Americans whatsoever that we saw, and it's a very interesting place to visit because of the fact that we were at war with them for a long time, and they seem to have forgot it. This is a map of modern day Vietnam. We're going to discuss the tour that we did, a small group, and a good friend of mine who was in Vietnam with me back in 2007. We went back to Vietnam, and we started out in Bangkok, flew immediately to Hanoi, over to Haiphong and Halong Bay, to Hue, Phu Bai, Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, Nha Trang, Phan Rang, Dalat, Saigon, Can Tho, and we ended up back in Bangkok. We started out in Hanoi, and what was so different about Hanoi? Because it is totally different than every other place we went to in Vietnam. It's the capital of Vietnam. It was the capital of Vietnam, of North Vietnam during the war, and it's the headquarters for the Vietnamese Communist Party. It's extremely conservative, and it's totally unlike the rest of Vietnam. We drove in, saw a real mix of architecture, old French villas, some modern architecture that I would probably classify as 70s American style design. Russian architecture, which is rather boxy and totally devoid of any real design flair at all. And then we went into Old Hanoi. Old Hanoi was a very old part of the city. And it was interesting because you go down a street and they sold one product down that whole street. We went down Bamboo Street. Everything on Bamboo Street was made of bamboo. We went down Steel Street. Everything on Steel Street was made of steel. Paper Street, nothing but paper shops. And these all opened up onto the sidewalk, and you just kind of walk down through there like you would in a mall, but it's a lot different. And the smell was really interesting because it was very old and musty. We went to the Ho Chi Minh Memorial. Uncle Ho died at the end of the war in 1969, and they embalmed him and put him in a glass casket and built a memorial to him. He's still in that casket. I read a couple of years ago where they opened it up and just checked him out to make sure he's still doing okay. And he was okay, so they closed it back up and put him back on exhibit again. One of the things we saw while we were there was the memorial to shooting down John McCain. And that was interesting. McCain was flying a mission bombing downtown Hanoi, and an anti-aircraft gun shot him down. And so he crashed his plane into a lake right on the edge of downtown Hanoi, and got out of the plane and was immediately captured by the North Vietnamese and taken to prison. The plane sunk, and about 20 years ago, they pulled up some of the remnants of the airplane and made an art piece out of it. It's kind of interesting. It's very contemporary looking, and it's just pieces of old steel from his plane. Then we went over to see where McCain was kept, the infamous Hanoi Hilton, which has been torn down. But they saved the facade, and they saved the courtyard, and they saved a couple of the cells, including McCain's cell. And we went through all that. One of the things we did was go to a water puppet theater. And this is a very unique art form that's strictly North Vietnamese. You don't find it in the south part of the country. And it dates back to the 1100s. And rather than describe it, we're just going to show you a clip of what this looks like, because it's very unique. I thought I would be bored out of my gourd, but I found it really interesting. So check it out. We left Hanoi and drove over to Haiphong Harbor and Halong Bay. And on the way, we went through a big agricultural area, and some of the things we saw were pretty interesting. This is the largest rice-growing country in the world, and they still grow rice in virtually all their crops very primitively. You can see that. There's a water buffalo and a plow, a wood plow that's pretty basic. They irrigate their rice fields by hand. You see the water buffaloes and the little boys, the buffalo boys that take care of these animals, and these animals are very prized possessions. We saw a lot of fish farms in this area. Fish farms are all over Vietnam. It's a huge, huge industry, and they send a lot of fish all the way back to the United States. We stopped at a couple small towns in this area, had some coffee, one of them, and interesting to see how these people live, because they do live a lot differently than they do in the big city. We stopped at a communal housing development. There were about 1,000 units in this development. The government builds the shell, gives it to the tenant, and then the tenant has to finish it off himself or herself. And you'd see some of these units that were finished pretty nice, and some of them that were really basic. And but it was the way they handled government housing in North Vietnam. It's pretty interesting. We got over to Halong Bay, and this is a very interesting place because it's very unique geology. These mountains are essentially limestone karst mountains, and they've eroded but with all the water and all the salt over the years, and they've left these really interesting geological shapes. And as is typical with a lot of limestone and water areas, there are a lot of caves in these. So we went down in a couple of the caves, and there are a lot of bats in some of them, and they eat bats over there, and that's a pretty interesting subject to discuss these days with the COVID-19 scenario. We left Halong Bay, went back to Hanoi, got on a plane and flew to Phu Bai. Landed on an airport runway strip that we had actually rebuilt for the 101st Airborne. Next day we went out to the Citadel. This is one of my strongest memories of Vietnam, was going to the Citadel one afternoon with my friend Don Schlotz. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, the North Vietnamese invaded Hue and took over the Citadel. The Citadel was a walled city where the Nguyen emperor lived. The imperial palace was in there, library, churches, Buddhist churches, several other major structures. During the battle for the Citadel, this place was destroyed. The North Vietnamese held this for 30 days. And that battle pretty well changed the war, because all of a sudden everybody realized, hey, these guys aren't going anywhere. After the war, the communist government wouldn't fix the Citadel back up because they wouldn't recognize the Nguyen dynasty as legitimate rulers of Vietnam. And the people in Hue got really upset about this because they had this great facility there in ruin and they wanted it fixed. So they said, okay, government, you won't do this. We're going to do it ourselves. So they did, and they would just get volunteer labor, and they went out and fixed it, and they rebuilt it, and it's a great structure today, and it's a huge tourist draw and a big thing for the economy in that area. We went to the Nguyen cemetery one day and saw where all the emperors were buried and their thousands of wives. They all had a bunch of them, and then we lived down in Hue for a few days. We lived in a really interesting hotel that was very mid-century modern French design and fascinating building, all concrete and detailing like you don't see anywhere and you can't get anymore. Great building. We also were right behind a famous bridge that Gustav Eiffel designed. Eiffel did a lot of bridges in Vietnam because he was French and it was a French colony at that point. And this was one of his largest bridges. We left Hue and we drove down to Da Nang, which was only 50 miles down the road. I drove that road many times because when I was the company commander when we were in Phu Bai, and have to go down to battalion headquarters quite a bit. And I was always impressed with how attractive that drive was. It's a beautiful, beautiful road. We went to China Beach, and when we got to Da Nang, and that was where I lived the last 2 months of my tour. And that was a nice place to stay. China Beach is a great beach. My hooch was probably about 50 yards from the ocean. We had some surfboards. We had a couple little sunfish sailboats, and we had a good time down there. And it was very pretty. There are a few remnants left from from when the Americans were in Da Nang. You see a couple jet fighter hangars at the airport and a few barracks, but for the most part they're all in ruin. Da Nang's downtown area has really grown a lot, and there's a lot of big buildings, high rises. They were building a big soccer stadium there, and I was really amazed at how light the roof structure was. You could sure never do that in the United States, and especially here in Utah, where we have seismic codes. So it was interesting. We went down to Hoi An one day. Hoi An is interesting because it really wasn't a Vietnamese town. It was built by the Japanese and the Chinese to do trade with the Vietnamese in that area. And you'll see the architecture is either reflects the Japanese or the Chinese. We were building a road into Hoi An, and we were building it out of concrete, sand and cement. If you look closely at a couple of these pictures, you'll see that that's a concrete road, and that's the one we built, and it's still there. And it's 50 years later, and that's pretty good life for a road. Hoi An is now a big arts community. There's a lot of galleries there, and actually while I was there, I bought an art piece. It's a contemporary Vietnamese painting, and that's kind of an oxymoron. It's done with lacquer paint and eggshell, and that's a process that's very common in the Far East, but you don't see a lot of contemporary stuff done with it. But anyway, that painting's on the wall in our living room, and I've always liked it. Went to a seafood market here one day. You see a lot of wet markets in Vietnam. No refrigeration, seafood or meat or whatever out in the open. And there's a lot of debate as to whether that should just be outlawed because of the issues with viruses and the cleanliness of the thing. But there are a lot of them there. This picture of the Jeep is here because it belonged to an expatriate, and I wanted to talk about the expatriates. We ran into a bunch of them, and when we were in Hoi An, I met one, and he was from Pikeville, Kentucky, which wasn't too far from where I'm from originally, and he was a retired E7 Master Sergeant in the Army, married a Vietnamese woman, and came back to Vietnam because he told me, he said, I can live like a king on my military retirement here, and I sure can't do that in the United States. And so you see a lot of expatriates there, and they're really enjoying it. We left Hoi An and drove down to My Son one day. The My Son ruins are what's left of the most revered Cham temple in Vietnam. The Chams took Vietnam around 500 AD. They held the central part of the country for 600 or 700 years. They came from Malaysia, and they were Hindu. And so you see the Hindu design, you see some Sanskrit on the walls here, and unfortunately a lot of this temple area was destroyed during the war, but a lot of it still exists, and this is the oldest area that reflects the Cham people. We then flew to Cam Ranh Bay, or what's left of Cam Ranh Bay, which isn't much. And that's interesting because Cam Ranh Bay was huge. It was one of, if not the largest, military base in Vietnam for the Americans. But the Russians took it over 25 years, or after the war, and ran it for a long time. And they pretty well tore down everything that the Americans did in Cam Ranh Bay. There isn't much left there. However, There is one thing left, and that's the landing strip there. It's the largest landing strip in Vietnam, but they don't use the harbor at all, or the bay anymore, and the landing strip is used primarily to bring people to Nha Trang, which is a resort area about 40 miles north of Cam Ranh. We went up to Nha Trang, spent a couple days on the beach up there. It's a gorgeous beach, and they built a lot of really high-end resort hotels there, and we stayed at one of those. But then we left, Don and I left our tour, and we struck off on our own. We had made arrangements to do this. We had rented a car, a driver, and we had to hire an interpreter. But we wanted to go back to the area that we had actually worked and lived in. And our tour wasn't going to really do that. So we left the tour for 3 or 4 days and went on our own. We drove into Phan Rang. We saw a lot of propaganda on the road, some of which was really interesting, some of which was almost totally camp. Went to some renovated Cham temples that I had gone to back during my original tour. I climbed this hill to go up and check these ruins out. The government rebuilt these Cham temples 15, 20 years ago and did a really good job. And this is now the headquarters for the Hindu religion in Vietnam. We also went back and looked at a bridge that we had rebuilt 4 or 5 times, because the planking for the bridge was designed to be 4-inch hardwood, and we couldn't get 4-inch hardwood. So the Army would send us 2x12 Douglas fir. We put 2 of them together, and Douglas fir isn't a hardwood, and it'd start coming apart a couple days after we put it down. So we just kept replacing these planks constantly. It was just a continual maintenance issue. Don and I laughed about that a lot. That was his job, and he ended up having to do it all the time. Then we went over to Song Pha, which was really where we lived. We lived out in the boonies, about 40 miles from our battalion headquarters. And Song Pha was a very small village at the base of a big mountain. And we were building the road up that mountain. It's QL 27 today. It's an 8 to 10 degree slope, switchbacks everywhere. And we were building it through triple canopy jungle. It took 2 years to build that 12-mile stretch around. We found this 96-inch culvert that we replaced 3 times while we were there. First time we put it in, about 2 weeks later, the Viet Cong blew it up. So we dug it up and replaced it again. And about 2 months later, a typhoon hit and washed it out. We replaced it again. The 3rd time was a charm, and it's still there after 50 years. So we did it right the 3rd time. Song Pha is the same little village it was 50 years ago. No different. And I'm sure it's not going to be different in the future, because rural Vietnam just isn't really growing. It's a simple life, and totally different than the cities. We stayed in Dalat while we were there. Dalat was built as a resort back in the 20s. A lot of very nice French villas up there. A couple really nice hotels. But Dalat has become the produce capital of Vietnam. The weather is so good there for growing crops, produce, vegetables, fruit. It's trucked all over Vietnam, down the road that we built. And we stayed at a really nice hotel up there that was built back in the 20s and was renovated about 15 years ago. It's a 5-star hotel. It's gorgeous. We also visited the last palace that the Nguyen dynasty built, and it was up in this area. It was totally different than anything in Vietnam. It was French. It was very Art Deco, and didn't fit in at all, but it was a cool building. And we left the lot, headed to Saigon. Saigon's a big city, and it's a Western city. It's almost like an American city, and that's because the Americans pretty well developed it. It's a Western lifestyle. Bars, nightclubs, everybody dresses in Western clothes. The streets are just filled with motorcycles primarily, and you take your life into your hands, or when you cross the road. We spent a night with 3 or 4 people at the Rex Hotel, which is a very famous hotel in Saigon. This was where all the officers and senior officers and generals lived early in the war. And one of the most famous parts of it is they have a rooftop bar up there on the top of this hotel that overlooks all of downtown Saigon. It's rated as one of the 10 best bars in the world by people that rate bars, I guess. We closed that place down one night and drank a lot of beer and told a lot of war stories. And the more beer we drank, the more outrageous the stories got. But had a good time. It was a good memory. We also went over one afternoon to the Cu Chi tunnels, and Cu Chi was about 30 miles outside of Saigon. During the French Revolution, the Vietnamese built an entire complex of tunnels underground under Cu Chi. During the American War, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese took these tunnels over and used them again. And they had hospitals down there. They had cafeterias. They had barracks. They had warehouses. And the Americans knew they were there, but they never really found many of them. And we went down into them, and it was very interesting. I will tell you that the Cu Chi tunnels were not designed for guys that were 6'4", and it was a little claustrophobic, but it was a pretty interesting experience. The last day we left Saigon, and we got on a small boat and went down the Mekong River to Can Tho. You can see these are some really high-end condominiums on the riverfront here, and they come without any sewers. And they just dump everything into the water. It's the way they live down there, and a lot of people live on boats on the river. The Mekong River is 2 miles wide at this point. There's a lot of people that just live on boats and run up and down the river, bringing material up to Saigon. I'd like to close with a picture of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's such a simple design, but it is so emotional. I know 6 people who are on this wall. They gave the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Rest in peace, guys. Thanks for what you did.